I call this talk Musings on Climate Change. Musings, everybody know what musings is, thinking somehow, working through the concept of what we face as a society here and what we face in other places. Let me just say, by the way, I really appreciate your inviting me to the faculty and the staff and Dr. Murphy. It's a great pleasure to be here. This is a special school for me, and so I'm really happy to be here. All right, that being, climate change is created by both natural as well as other kinds of activities. And therefore, human activity is a part of the potential change of climate. You follow? At the 21st century area, that the greenhouse gases, which I'll cover in a second, by human activity, will affect the climate by 1 to 2%. You haven't heard that before. I also saw a 1 to 3% human activity in this period of time to affect climate. So what's affecting climate? It is human activity, but it's a piece of it. And the reason I raise this is because when you listen to folks talk about flooding, talk about hurricanes, talk about bird loss, talk about rising oceans, you need to ask the question, on what model, on what basis are they making that distinction? Because most scientists in the world who work for the UN and who have issued a report, for those of you taking note, the International Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, is the one who says that we are in deep trouble. They say that based on their models, that we are confronting a major crisis for the world on climate change. And I say to you, they're not wrong. But if you look, according to Dr. Kunin and others, at the 55 models they use, they don't account for certain things which are natural. Water vapor, radiation, just clouds. They do it on a system to try to look at and project out. Our jobs, therefore, I think, is to figure out what we should do in response to uncertain scientific knowledge. And there's a policy for this. For those of you taking notes, it's called the no regrets policy. The no regrets policy, which says simply, whether you believe the scientists or the skeptics, the fact of the matter is that we need to be prepared for something, for some changes. The weather is going in that direction. Incidentally, just as a matter of note, I don't know if you saw it, just last week, a study was made of the temperature increase in the northwest portion of the United States. Conclusion, not because of human activity. Answer, over the next 100 years, the reason for the warmth in the northwest of the United States? The ocean. Winds off the ocean. And ladies and gentlemen, what I'm suggesting is oceans, which are sinks, carbon sinks. They draw in carbon dioxide, the main ingredient of greenhouse gases, just like forests do. They draw in. But oceans also push out carbon dioxide. They're reservoirs and sinks, they call them. So oceans, particularly the Pacific Ocean and others, are dramatically changing our climate as well. And maybe that's the other 98 or 97% of the things we're talking about. So, how do we, the reason I raise this is, and I hope to get questions at the end of this thing. The reason I raise it is, when you listen to politicians, I have been one, so I can talk about it. When you listen to the politicians in Congress, or right here, you're going to get those who stand around and say, There's no such thing as climate change. There's no such thing. I'm not funding it. I'm not doing anything with it. I'm not passing anything. And then the other side, you're going to have, these people are nuts. They think it's a hoax. It's not a hoax. All these scientists agree. And your job is to find the truth, which is a lot more modeling is needed, a lot more scientific information is needed, and what are we going to do about it? How do we respond? It is always a question of money versus the policy choices we take. Money versus policy choices. Economy, jobs, lost because of changes in the way we expect to get electricity. Literally, lost. People unemployed, potentially. So basic background, what are greenhouse gases? Carbon dioxide is the biggest piece, lasts for thousands of years. About 50% of the total amount of carbon dioxide that was in the air is still in the atmosphere. However, remember that carbon dioxide is also a key ingredient of the air we breathe and is key for vegetation and the oceans for photosynthesis. It's not a bad thing in itself. It's a bad thing because why? Too much of it allows the heat to come in and traps it around the earth, creating heat. Worse than carbon dioxide is methane. Methane. Then you got chlorofluorocarbons, nitrous oxide, and other ingredients. But carbon dioxide is the big one. It's the big one. The United States, I think in 2012, created 5.5 billion metric tons of carbon into the air. 5.5. China created 8.7 billion metric carbon units into the air. India is real close. India is real close. And all this carbon, of course, is what folks are pointing to as the potential, literally, to change the climate across the world. Now, part of the reason this is so important is that there have been attempts to try to deal with this quickly. The international community, everybody got together and said, you know what, 1997, we better do something because it's clear that things seem to be getting warmer. And we believe, we all know that we're spewing stuff into the air. They created what they call a Kyoto Protocol. Write it down, because the United States ultimately did not join the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol allowed for every country to have limits as to what they could put into the air. Every country. 197 countries signed up on it. It came to the United States, and one of the problems was it did not deal with developing nations. It dealt with developed nations like the United States and Britain and others. But the developing nations said, hey, wait, we're not going to start responding to this because we didn't create the problem. You developed nations did. Well, George Bush was president. George Bush, who are elected by citizens, and George Bush said, I'm not going for this. Developing nations, others, China, are not involved. And it's unfair to the United States, it will hurt us, and he refused to send it to the United States Senate for approval. So the Kyoto Protocol, done in 1997, which has all sorts of sections to it, was ultimately not approved by the United States, but President Bush said, well, we're going to try to do the things voluntarily anyway. Incidentally, the Kyoto Protocol, however, was accepted by the European Union. And actually, the European Union began to trade and cap and trade their carbon as a result of it. So it had major success in some places, but not here. So the IPC is getting more and more serious. They're saying, you know what? We are convinced now in 2013, the IPCC, International Panel of Climate Control, that 95% assurance global warming is being caused by human actions. And this is getting serious, because now we have a serious issue of greenhouse gases that I mentioned. So everybody turns to the EPA United States Environmental Protection Agency and says, you guys are responsible for the environment. Why don't we set up some rules regarding greenhouse gases, CO2 particularly? EPA says, not us. We're not. The Clean Air Act, which was done in 1970, covers other things. It doesn't cover greenhouse gases. It covers sulfur dioxide. It covers chlorofluorocarbons. It covers other. It does not, the Clean Air Act, ever mention climate change, greenhouse gases, or anything else. So what happened, of course, is EPA says, we're not interested in doing this. This is not part of the Clean Air Act. Massachusetts and a few other states sued the EPA. And for those of you who are lawyers, it's called Massachusetts v. EPA. Massachusetts v. EPA. They sued on the basis that Massachusetts as a state would be harmed by virtue of flooding caused by climate change and the greenhouse gases, and therefore it had a stake in making sure that regulations controlling greenhouse gases from automobiles be undertaken. It went to the United States Supreme Court. And you know what it said? It said, yep, the EPA must look to see if it's dangerous, the greenhouse gases, and then if it is, to begin to regulate it. Mindful now, there's nothing in the Clean Air Act that says you have to deal with greenhouse gases. And I'm telling you this for a purpose. It'll come back in 2 minutes. There's nothing in the act. But the United States Supreme Court acted. The only way you can change that is some congressional decision. There is none. So President Obama comes in and says, I am going to create regulations for coal plants, in particular, as creating CO2. And I'm going to spread it across the nation so that my goal, President Obama, is to reduce by 17% by the year 2025 carbon dioxide emissions across the United States. And we're going to produce these rules and regulations even though it's not in the Clean Air Act, and he proceeded to do that. So lawsuits will be showing up because Congress failed to act, and because the act doesn't mention greenhouse gases. And now what's happened? Now the EPA has established regulations for all coal plants, to reduce by the year 2025 by 30% carbon dioxide emissions from coal plants. Coal plants there are 600 coal plants in the United States. They produce 77% of the carbon dioxide that we emit in the United States. They employ 100,000 people, jobs. The coal plants, 100,000 people, and for every one of those people, there are 3.5 people who support them in the chain. There are 500 jobs in the coal industry. President Obama wants jobs. If he shuts the coal plants down, the major contributor, what happens to 500,000 jobs? To say nothing of even more important. Coal is the cheapest of all electricity in terms of the use of coal to produce. It's about 1/4 of the cost of natural gas. So people in West Virginia and Ohio and Pennsylvania, most of whom get their electricity from coal, cheap coal, will not have it. Can they afford the higher, 3/4 higher, natural gas? Can they afford it as Americans? So the fight in Congress today, and the fight that is about to come and you will read about, is the question of whether the United States government has the right, without an act, to regulate coal plants as greenhouse gases with no authorization from Congress that will affect hundreds of thousands of people's jobs and the livelihood of the economy. That's question one. Those regulations, by the way, for those of you taking notes, should be available in draft form by 2015. The first piece that came out indicates that the states individually are responsible for reducing CO2. They'll have to set goals. And then the EPA will determine whether the goals are right, and then the states will have to implement them. And they can do it lots of different ways. They figure that you can save 113 million tons of carbon a year by using natural gas instead of coal. 113. So it's not insignificant. Let me close up with one other point, and then I'll take questions. Transportation and vehicle emissions, I suggested, is about 1.9 billion metric tons. So it's not insignificant. You have 10 miles away a construction of a new bridge called the Tappan Zee Bridge. What it'll be called in the future, we don't know. But that bridge, one of the reasons it's important is because, one of the reasons why it had to be built is because you have 110,000 vehicles per day going across it, and they get congested, and everybody understands congestion. But one of the most important things is, in our New York metropolitan region, we have to go to mass transportation when we can do it. Why? Because cars sitting and idling, cars crossing the Tappan Zee Bridge constantly, the metropolitan area cannot handle it in the future. Shouldn't. So when you're in a cocktail conversation about the new bridge, ask the question, what about mass transportation? What about buses? What about eventually a railroad to move people to New York City, the Bronx, White Plains, to Newburgh on that Tappan Zee Bridge? So far, the state has said we're not interested in doing mass transportation. Ladies and gentlemen, that's important. I mean, if we're going to try to deal with greenhouse gases, you've got to start with vehicles because, especially in metropolitan areas. Rockland County joined a group of other counties where we did all sorts of new things. We have new hybrid buses, okay? Battery and gases. We have a law in Rockland County, you cannot idle for more than 3 minutes with your car or get a ticket. We're trying to do the little pieces. But think of what's going to happen. What about people in Orange County? Mass transportation becomes a critical component, particularly for metropolitan areas. So I would suggest to you, when you vote, you want to ask a candidate in the Assembly or the Senate, or somebody even as a supervisor or a county executive, where do you stand on the issue of mass transportation versus vehicles everywhere? So, humans are contributing to global warming. Is it as bad as the worst folks say? Could be. Do we have to do nothing? No. We have to do something. You have to be prepared. It is important that $1 billion be spent in the MTA to protect New York City against future Sandys. It has to be done. But our jobs as citizens are to listen to candidates who run and say, where do you stand on fracking? Where do you stand on nuclear power? Where do you stand at Indian Point? Do you believe in the Kyoto Protocol, that we should join just like other countries? How do you feel about giving money to developing countries? They want $100 billion, by the way. $100 billion. The United States said, no, I don't think so. But they want money to be able to build technologically appropriate material, and they need money in developing countries, and they're saying to the developed countries, you give us $100 billion. That's another issue that didn't go well. So here are my final questions before I ask you questions. Which alternatives are best on a global basis? Here, and for those that I've talked about in terms of making decisions. From a global perspective, which are best for the United States energy independence? Which are the best to fight poverty and keep jobs going? Which are the best to hold on to the economy and not disrupt it? And how much can we afford to do? What's the cost in human terms? And how do we feel about not just the intra-generations, but the intergenerations, your grandchildren, and the decisions we make today on these issues? Keystone, coal plants, nuclear plants. Bottom line is that we have no choice other than to tell scientists to do a better job to convince everybody who's questioning that their models and the climates will produce an effect that we can somehow agree on. That in the meantime, we prepare the best way we can, not to destroy, but to be prepared for what comes. And that we participate in democracy. Why? Because the very people who are making these decisions, whether they're Harry Reid or Vanderhoef or anybody, they're making decisions on your behalf that you will live with. Shoreham was made by politicians because they were afraid, and that could have produced electricity that could have saved parts of Long Island in terms of major carbon emissions. So, my point, watch the headlines. These are both national, international issues.